What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Watch Dogs, a 2014 game from Ubisoft all about hacking and overreach, invasions of privacy, all sorts of stuff, which has only ever grown to be more of an issue in the modern era. But before we get into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below covering everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. But in the case of Watch Dogs, it's a bit of an interesting situation because I bought this game on Steam when it initially released. I put well over 100 hours into it before even touching it to make this review. The thing is, while this may seem like a weird game to touch in 2026, just last year actually, the game received Steam achievements for the first time. Previously, you had them accessible via Ubisoft Connect, as it's known today, or back then, Uplay. So what you would do is just load the game up on Steam after this, and it transfers all of it over to Steam at once for you, even if the dates will be a little wrong. Now, in doing that, I only had 5 achievements left to gather, one of which was an online achievement, which actually turned out to be much easier than I thought it would. Got that more on accident, testing to see if the online multiplayer was still working, and it is, but we'll get into that. So as the 100% goes, I did the bulk of it quite some time ago, and this time I was mostly just playing through to remind myself of the content and grab those couple of things that I was missing that aren't particularly difficult. All of that said, however, let's dive into the rest of this. So Watch Dogs, like many a Ubisoft title, is an open-world adventure. In particular, this one taking on a neo-noir style that the later games kind of abandoned, though it does kind of work in this game's favor in terms of making it a unique experience, and I think, especially when it comes to Ubisoft games, that probably sums up why I liked this game more than a lot of their other titles, actually. Watch Dogs, while definitely retaining some of their classic open-world formula, also does some unique stuff in just how interactable that environment is as you're hacking your way through it, because the premise of Watch Dogs is that the city of Chicago is being used as a testing ground for this citywide operating system that unsurprisingly can be hacked and gives a person like yourself access to it, which lets you do things like switch the streetlights, raise or lower bridges, blow up pipes underground, that type of thing. And for me at least, it's a combination of those things that makes Watch Dogs so compelling. It's a game that was a little bit ahead of its time in terms of talking about just how serious things like privacy have gotten in the digital age, but also makes a game that is incredibly interactive from a standpoint of literally being able to hack into things to force them to do what you want them to do or set up emergent things. All while having a more serious tone, in my opinion, that the later games kind of abandoned. But that's not to say it's perfect. It certainly had some growing pains along the way, and hopefully I'll outline some of that stuff for you across this review. But first things first, let's talk a little bit about the multiplayer. Now, this review is not going to be heavily involved in the multiplayer, but it's some stuff that bears some mention here. If you buy this game in a more recent fashion, you may have some trouble getting the multiplayer or online components to actually run. This seems to be, best I can tell, though to be clear, this is an educated guess at best, to have something to do with the switch from Uplay to Ubisoft Connect, which is as good a place as any to mention that you do in fact need the Ubisoft launcher still in order to play this, as it is connected, and it seems like it can have some trouble validating what's going on and won't necessarily let you online as a result of that. So while the online portion is still up and working, if you buy this game today, especially on a platform that is not Ubisoft's launcher, like Steam for instance, you might run into a problem there. It doesn't seem to affect everybody, but it's enough people to be noticeable, which is a shame because the multiplayer that is here was relatively fun. It would often see you either hacking other characters or tailing them, or them trying to do that to you and you tracking them down in the city via your profiler or your phone using the city operating system to gather information about the people you are running into. There's also the free roam aspect of it. Obviously, it doesn't really occur in missions, but there's a lot of stuff going on if you choose to have it on, though you can just turn it off altogether. And if you want to play with that, there's some extra reward tracks specifically for multiplayer. I did the vast majority of that when I played the game originally, but as time wears on, especially 12 years from release, you're going to continue to find that more and more difficult to do as a result of the things I've just just laid out, like for instance it just straight up not working for some people. That's probably not a problem that's going to get better with time, especially given all the recent Ubisoft news. But that's not the only sort of technical thing I want to mention here. This is not a game free of technical problems either, and while the game is hardly unplayable or anything, there's still some stuff worth taking note of here. For starters, the game did occasionally freeze and crash on me. About the roughly 40 or so hours I spent going through this game recently for this, I encountered that a handful of times, not exactly game-breaking, but annoying to be sure. However, there was one extremely consistent bug, and I'm wondering if it's not to do with modern hardware and the frame rates, because as you may notice in some of the footage, poor Aiden Pierce here, our main character's coat could not stop just glitching out constantly. That was a problem throughout the entire playthrough, which again, annoying but not exactly game-breaking. A crime against fashion at most. Keeping it moving, however, you may be surprised to hear it, but this game does actually have difficulty modifiers. You just have to dig to find them. The game never brings them up unless you specifically go rooting through the options for them, and for the most part I actually think that's fine. I think the normal difficulty works for this game in particular, but if for whatever reason you want to mess around with it a little bit, you can swap between easy, normal, hard, or realistic. Now, as the difficulty goes up, you are easier to kill and you're going to run into more enemies, though you can actually use that to your favor in one specific achievement called Negative Eugenics in the DLC. There's a really easy way to get it if you crank the difficulty up on a specific mission, but again, the game's never going to bring this up to you. It's just there if you want to go looking for it. Which then brings us to the story of Watch Dogs. Now, the story is an interesting situation because I like the story well enough for what it is, but like many people, I'm not wild about the main character specifically. To be honest, the guy kind of has negative charisma. Although, I think in at least some people's case, that may well work to their advantage because Aiden Pierce here has so neutral, I guess, of a stance on most things. But on the flip side of that, he doesn't exactly get caught up in the morals of the story either all the time, which given the, I would say, subject matter isn't always the worst thing in the world, but more on that in a moment. You see, the story of Watch Dogs follows Aiden Pierce, a hacker extraordinaire, if you will, following a job gone wrong, specifically about a year after a job gone wrong, when you and your partner tried to infiltrate a hotel known as, I believe it's the Merlot, but unsurprisingly it goes wrong. The backlash for this, the retaliation, is that they hunt you down, find you, and attack you, which ultimately results in the death of your niece, Lena. This obviously has a profound effect on Aiden, who is seeking revenge for it. For starters, trying to track down who did this, which is where the game properly starts. You find the literal trigger man, but obviously he wasn't the one that called the hit in to begin with. And much of the story revolves around exactly that. However, Aiden still has some family left via his sister Nikki and her other child, Jax, who become a big focal point around what's left, because what starts as looking into what happened here and who called the shots basically turns into a grander conspiracy involving the company running the OS that's been implemented around the city, the local mob boss, and a couple of other characters. Now, I don't want to go into like every play-by-play of the story, but there's also some really good characters in here. For starters, we have Clara, our helper via a organization known as DedSec, which comes up a lot more in 2 and I believe Legion as well, but I haven't played that one. DedSec is essentially just a hacker group that also has problems with what the city operating system is going to do to society at large and aims to stop it. She is the person responsible as a result then of getting you a lot of the hacks and stuff that allow you to interact with much of the city in the ways that we do. Another great character is T-Bone. T-Bone is actually my favorite character in this game, otherwise known as Raymond Kinney. Sort of a grunge rocker type, but this guy has the distinct honor, I guess you could call it, of being the mastermind behind the operating system that the city is actually using. He had a lot of problems with Bloom, the company behind it, who he used to work for, and he tried to prove that by causing a blackout via some of the vulnerabilities of the system, which resulted in a lot of deaths, and so he ultimately goes into hiding. I want to talk a little bit about T-Bone specifically here just because he is a character that I think easily could have stood in as the main character, which I think is actually further proven by the DLC in which you actually play as T-Bone, which is where we get a first taste of some of like the gadgets and things that come up in the later titles. But there's still more, because you were not alone when you initially hacked into that hotel. You were with your partner who taught you the things you know, Damian Brinks. And he, I think, is a great character, especially towards the later acts of the game, and a little bit of spoilers here, by the way, but I think in setting a lot of these characters up, they kind of get at the heart of some of the different types of hacking you see done in the world, whether that be to expose security flaws and try to fix them, or actively take control via like malicious software in order to do damage. But Damien in particular is a good example of that latter statement, where he actually shows, especially with a certain level of access to the operating system and all of its systems and how they affect all of the city here, if someone wanted to use that specifically to cause destruction and mayhem, just how bad that could actually get. And I think that's a fun way to examine the story in a game like this. But we're hardly done yet, because then there's also the fixers. These are basically just mercs for hire in the digital age, and one of those is Jordy, a guy with a ton of charisma but exactly zero moral compass, who helps you with some of your early work. But more than anything, it's a story and a lot of gameplay actually that I think touch on subjects that are still extremely relevant 12 years later, if anything more so probably. And so while I don't really love Aiden as a character all that much, I can't deny that the story still reels me in, especially since the tone of it is much more serious than Watch Dogs 2, for instance. But all of that does bring us to the progression systems of this game. There's a fair bit of progression here, largely coming down to your skills, weapons, cars, items you'll be able to acquire, things like that. Some of this is tied to the main story. Like, for instance, you have to do the first few main missions in order to get access to the bulk of the operating system hacks that you can put in, because before that you have limited access until Clara hooks you up with DedSec's access to the system. But as you do basically anything, you'll gain experience, which then will give you skill points potentially, which you can then use to unlock these skills and improve everything from driving, crafting, combat skills, all that sort of usual stuff. The big ones really, in my opinion though, are the ones that allow you to hack more of the city, as those give you just more options in essentially every situation, because it's everywhere. On top of that, there's also progression via weapons. Now, all the way back when I played this game originally and there were challenges for the Ubisoft launcher side of things, I had completed those, which gave me access to silenced weapons immediately. Silenced weapons are like the be-all end-all in this game because of the way the game is sort of a cover shooter that favors a stealth approach for the most part. Having a silenced weapon is going to make your life so much easier. So I had those straight away, but normally that's progression that you have to unlock as an example. Otherwise, you want to like silently do melee takedowns. And so your weapons are a big part of progression. This also applies to cars. As you interact with more cars, you can then use Car on Demand, as it's called, to order them up. Completing some challenges on the Ubisoft side of things can get you some cars that you can order for free, which will save you some money, though money's pretty abundant. And then lastly, items, things like explosives or one-time use hacks. Not every hack that you have access to is something you can do all the time, but rather via crafting materials that you'll pick up, you can cobble together to use exactly one time, such as a temporary blackout. So there's a fair bit of progression here, but nothing crazy for what an open world game is, which then brings us to the gameplay and world side of things. Now this is an especially interesting subject for this game to me specifically, because just to get out of the way, I really enjoy what Watch Dogs did with its city, as well as just the interactivity of it, as I've already mentioned. And yet, if you were to describe individual parts of it, it's probably going to sound exactly like the open world checklist that Ubisoft often makes, because at its core, that's still what it is. I think they just managed to add a level of interactivity here that their other games don't quite match, for me at least. But like many a Ubisoft game, the core of it is first going and finding the tower. That's actually more important in this game than you might realize, because the first thing in any zone that you find yourself in of Chicago that you need to go do in order to use any of your hacking is to go hack the tower there. This will give you access to the operating system in that zone. It's also going to unlock substations for the operating system. Those substations that you can then go hack will uncover actual collectibles and content within that given zone in order to show you what you're going to be trying to track down. This will also unlock your hideouts, or various places that you can fast travel to around the city, and it's also where you can change your clothes and sleep if you want, though that's rarely necessary. Otherwise, however, much of what we're going to be doing is exploring the city, doing either main or side missions, and our investigations and gathering up collectibles. So let's talk a little bit about that stuff individually. Now, side missions are usually contracts of a given type. This is stuff like driving cars really fast through the town, trying to distract the police, going in and busting up gang bases, tracking down criminal convoys to turn them over to the police by beating them senseless and leaving them there. That sort of thing. Then there are the investigations. Investigations usually involve exactly that, going to a certain point, gathering up some information, and then when you have all of them, that is to say all of the interactable points on the map completed, it culminates in a final mission that then gives you the end of that little storyline presented in said investigation. There's one that I don't really want to show you because of some of the subject matter, which is you can get involved in a human trafficking ring, or putting a stop to it to be more specific, after it comes up during the story, and you can go track down a bunch of information before finally getting to the guy actually responsible for it. There is a serial killer you can track down by finding a bunch of his victims around the city before getting a mission to put a stop to the guy specifically. There are privacy invasions, files you can find just kind of in the ether, if you will, as you move around. The privacy invasions in particular are interesting, mostly because they're exactly that, you invading somebody's privacy, which might, show you some things you don't necessarily want to see, while also, of course, usually stealing funds, that kind of thing. So far, so thematic, but we're not actually done yet. The city is also full of a whole host of different mini-games, such as the drinking mini-game, or like these AR games you can play, betting games, all sorts of just things to interact with. And then that, while you're out in the open world and not on a mission, is also in contention with, if you have it turned on, all the online stuff that can happen, like people popping into your game without it notifying you, and then of course trying to either download and hack from you or just hail you. And all of that stuff combined with the hacking just makes for a city that feels incredibly interactive in a way that a lot of other games just don't. And that's before we even start talking about the best part of all of this, which is the profiling system. You see, in order to do almost everything I just mentioned, you have to use your phone's profiler. This effectively shows you information about everybody you look at, which will allow you to do things like hack their bank, unlock cars in the app, potentially steal music from them for a collectible achievement, that kind of thing. But it also does something else, which is gives you a name, an occupation, what that person might be currently going through, which means that every individual character you look at, well, honestly, you're not going to spend any time with them, and they're not especially important in most cases, as it's not like they really have like a schedule or anything. They're just kind of going to pop in and out, but it does so much in terms of just adding a little bit of life to this game in a way that a sort of metaphorically faceless person you would pass on the street of a city might. And then you, of course, have to make that distinction of, do I want to rob this individual person's bank account? Sure, the rich people up in the Mad Mile section might not necessarily matter, but if you go to the wards and start hacking the bank accounts of poor people, you're not exactly doing a good thing there, are we? And all of that actually plays back into your reputation, because you see, Aiden has been a vigilante, which I waited to talk about until this part specifically because I think it made the most sense here in terms of talking about the city. Aiden, acting as a vigilante, is using his access to this system to put stops to all sorts of crime, which you can actually do in-game. Occasionally, the system will notify you of a potential crime about to happen based on the information it's getting from everybody, and then you can go choose to intervene if that crime happens, and that will do things like up your reputation. And your reputation amongst citizenry as the vigilante will determine like how often people call the cops on you, if you're carjacking someone to chase them down, that kind of thing. But if you're just killing people left and right, civilians, police officers, that kind of thing, your reputation will go down and people can sort of turn on you. And so, while a great deal of the sort of moral justification of the things you are doing does in fact come down to you, the player, reality is, in escaping these police chases, the car crashes you're almost likely certainly going to cause, the disruptions to the city itself, like causing blackouts, there are very real consequences to the things you are doing, and that is actually illustrated in T-Bone's story, because that blackout he caused straight up killed a bunch of people, and to think the things that you are doing would not have similar collateral damage would be naivety. But I actually think the way the game presents it is great, because you don't see a lot of that stuff, and so the morals of it come down to you, the player, kind of understanding the implications here. And for all of those reasons, I don't think Aiden is a particularly good person, regardless of how you choose to play as the guy. But on the flip side of that, it's not exactly like the people he's dealing with are great people either, and so in some ways I would say he's the best guy for the job, but man oh man would it be too much to ask for like a little bit of charisma. So yes, on one hand there are the literal gameplay systems of this game that you are interacting with that, if you want to boil it down, are absolutely Ubisoft's very typical checklist type of stuff. And yet, if you dig a little deeper than that and see the message of the game for what it is, there's an ever so slight spark of brilliance in there that it's a shame they were really never able to properly capitalize on with the sequels. Because all of that really is like the biggest reasons that I really love this game, even in spite of its flaws. But from there, let's talk a little bit about the combat system. Combat in this game is very simple. There's some layers to it, fun things you can do and interact with, but at its core, it's just not a complicated thing. It is essentially a stealth-preferred cover shooter. You do not have to go in stealthy or anything like that, but it is preferred just because you are relatively easy to kill, and going in guns blazing usually just makes your job harder than it really needs to be, especially once you get silenced weapons. But combat is basically a combination of the weapons you are using, the items you are using, as well as the things around you in your environment that you can use to hack, which can, if you are utilizing everything, result in like a few emergent moments where you can really get a satisfying feel of taking down a bunch of enemies and maybe never being seen or just crushing them so thoroughly it doesn't matter. Which is especially handy given that you can, before you even go into a combat situation in most cases, have the ability to hack the cameras and things around, which will give you access to like the layout of the area, maybe get you to track down the specific target you're looking for. All before you even set foot into the place you're about to actually start combat, and that's another reason the silenced weapons are really good, because you can get a complete layout of the enemies and then slowly sneak in and take people out one by one if you want. You can also, of course, map out the things you could potentially use for hacking, be that making cover on the fly via, like pop-up barricades or fuse boxes you can rig to explode, that kind of stuff. And it's really just the environment in combination with the basic mechanics that make it interesting, and that's before you even start talking about the items. Now, in the base game, this is the stuff you would expect. Little electronic items that you can throw to attract enemies and position them the way you want them in so you can move between places without getting seen. Grenades, IEDs, proximity bombs, remote detonating bombs, sticky bombs, communication jammers to keep enemies from calling in reinforcements, just all of those various things. And for a game like this, I think combat absolutely works for what it is. I think the stealth approach in particular feels especially satisfying with silenced weapons. Silenced weapons feel fantastic, but even beyond that stuff, there is some really fun things you can do. For instance, one of the progression rewards you can get is a sniper rifle that will shoot through walls. That does a few things for you. One, later game enemies called, I believe, enforcers will have just like head-to-toe Kevlar armor, and that sniper rifle will still one-shot them, potentially even through a wall. It will also one-shot vehicles as people are trying to get away, and to make that even more fun, there's a mechanic called focus, which will sort of slow down time and allow you to line up your shots, and in combination with all that stuff, there is a really fun guns blazing approach with things like shotguns and swapping out weapons and taking out enemies through walls even, or setting up remote detonations, things like that. That is also just a really fun time. The DLC, Bad Blood, actually takes us a little bit farther by introducing things like an RC car in our first look at some of the gadgets that would become commonplace in the other games. And yet, there is one big complaint I have about combat, which is actually that the cover system they have you using is a very clunky system. Basically, you push a button to fully lock yourself into cover, and then you're supposed to press that same button again when looking at a given area in order to quickly transition from cover. In and of itself, that's fine for what the game is, but what makes it annoying is that it's actually hard to get out of cover. Because even if you press the cover button again, there's a chance you might instead, because of the way it's set up, start trying to move to cover where you are looking rather than stepping out of cover. So sometimes it's really just hard to get your character to stop and try to get out of cover in a way that feels really clunky. It's not game breaking, and because of the way the combat is set up, it's not the end of the world or anything, but it gets annoying fast. But speaking of the DLCs, let's talk a little bit about that. This game does have a season pass, but there's basically two DLCs in particular that you want to know about, which are Bad Blood and Conspiracy. Conspiracy is really stupid, don't bother. Basically, it's a little AR mini game that you can put into the game in which cyborgs infiltrate Chicago and you have to take them down, except that's literally all there is. There's no progression to it. There's no rewards really. It just sucks. But then there's Bad Blood. Bad Blood puts you in the role of T-Bone following the events of the main story as he's trying to leave the city for good, finally. Now this is really fun because A, T-Bone is again my favorite character personally, which means getting to play as him is always a great time, but also he gets those extra gadgets and things like I mentioned with the RC car. On top of that, though, Bad Blood is basically just a continuation of that story through the lens of another character, and much of the content is the same. You get to completely run around Chicago again, including a whole new swath of side missions that completing them will give you access to more abilities, like the ability to blow up that RC car, as an example, for the negative eugenics achievement, things like that. And of course, the DLC has its own fairly decent-sized story, if not overly long, but for all of those reasons, Bad Blood is worth your time. If, provided of course you liked the base game and wanted to mess around with a couple different mechanics or a different character as an example, but that one is a good, robust DLC that is worth your time as mentioned, and you'll likely get it if you pick this game up as like the complete edition or with the DLC season pass or whatever. Which then brings us to the Steam Deck. So Watch Dogs 1 runs fine on the Steam Deck, however, that comes with the hassle of potential problems caused by the Ubisoft launcher. Hardware-wise, Watch Dogs actually has lesser recommended system requirement than the Steam Deck offers by default, and so once you get it running, it should run fine. But really the issue here at large is that you need to make sure Ubisoft Connect is in there and working correctly, which might require you to go to the desktop mode and kind of get it all set up there, at which point it should work from the regular Steam menu, but again, it might be hit or miss, and your mileage may well vary, but if you can get past that launcher issue, it should play fine there otherwise. Which brings us then to the positives and negatives. So the big positive for me when it comes to Watch Dogs is really just the overall concept, the execution of that concept, the way the world is set up, the interactivity of that world, how much you can do with it. It's just so much fun to play this game, which is one of the reasons it always stuck with me and why once I saw that they had added achievements to Steam, I wanted to go back and eventually play it for a review, and here we are. This game is like a guilty pleasure of mine in that way, and that is in spite of its negatives, and there are a few. Like a great many people, I don't like Aiden as a character. I think this is probably a problem they kind of overcorrected with the sequel, given that the entire tone of that game is quite different, but as main characters go, he's a bit uninspired, frankly. I would have loved to play through the game as T-Bone personally, but obviously that would have been a bit of a different story. Second, I didn't really mention it much here because it's kind of hard to find a place for it exactly, but the game has this like reliance on car chases, especially in the main story towards the end of it. Like you'll get done with the mission, be escaping the area, and suddenly you've got to escape this chase from either the police or the bad guys, and it does that a lot. And it seems to be their go-to way of trying to ramp up the difficulty and turn the city against you, and while that makes sense for the very last mission where it occurs, everywhere else it usually just feels like an annoyance. Now luckily, in side missions in particular, the side activities, you usually have the option of just killing all of the enemies instead, and because there's a finite number of them and they don't continue to respawn like with the police chases and stuff. You have alternatives, but it's kind of just annoying in general, and I would prefer it didn't do that. There's also the moment-to-moment cover problems in combat that make, again, just straight-up shootouts not very satisfying to me personally. And then last but not least, there is the aging multiplayer systems. People are already starting to have problems with the way multiplayer is set up here, given everything going on with Ubisoft in the recent news with all their recent game cancellations and reset, as they call it, as well. I have extreme doubts that they are going to update the aging multiplayer for this game and make it less of a hassle for new purchasers of the game. And while most of the multiplayer and the way it works here is like peer-to-peer, meaning there isn't, I think, a moment where like everything will get shut off per se, but there's clearly some sort of like setup that has to happen through the Ubisoft launcher for it to work, and that's already clearly becoming an issue for a significant amount of people, and I don't think that is going to get better as time goes by. Which brings me to my conclusion. For me, Watch Dogs 1 is, as I mentioned, a bit of a guilty pleasure. I really just love what this game was doing, even back when it launched, but even today, I think it still manages to be surprisingly unique, touching on issues that are, again, just as relevant today as they were at the time the game was made, and considering the way technology moves, that's not exactly a small feat. But more than anything, Watch Dogs is a game that does some unique and cool stuff that I think is worth experiencing. It does have its problems, some of which the sequel improved on, gameplay-wise. Watch Dogs 2, I think, is a game that plays better than Watch Dogs 1, as an example, but in spite of its flaws, some of the nature of, again, it's admittedly very checklisty open world in many ways, it still feels unique, and I think that's great, and that's before you even start talking about some of the popular mods people have made for this game, like the Living City one, which significantly expands like gameplay and exploration and features even. So long story short, roughly 12 years after the game's release, I still find it very enjoyable, but it's also got some problems, and some of those systems are aging that have me a little concerned, like the multiplayer system. And so when it comes to recommending this game, the game itself these days sells for $20 US. The complete version that comes with the DLC and everything is $30 US, but you can also find it on sale very regularly. And for all of those reasons, just on a pure recommendation standpoint, this game is on sale, again, fairly often, and because of that, I would wait for a big sale, grab the complete edition for as cheap as you can get it, and experience what it has to offer that way, so the, risk to entry is very low, and you're less likely to get burned by the inevitable problems that are going to continue with things like the Ubisoft launcher and stuff. So in that specific instance, I would recommend people try it, because again, there is something cool worth experiencing here, but there's things that, like the online stuff that you need to be aware of beforehand before you pull the trigger, ideally. But that is pretty much where I stand on Watch Dogs 1. I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. I do plan on eventually getting to Watch Dogs 2, which I have also played quite a bit of. I think I have like 50 or 60 hours in that one, but Watch Dogs Legion is not a game I have played. I have no idea about that one outside of course, just very general things that you can read up on a Steam page as an example, but I will also get to it eventually. Don't have an exact timeline for that, but they are games that I want to cover on the channel at some point, and I will eventually do so. Watch Dogs 2 I'll probably get to later this year sometime. Not really sure about Legion, but for today, that's pretty much going to do it. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about this one down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.